History isn't just written in textbooks, it's captured in moments frozen forever. Some photographs don't just document the past, they completely change how we understand it. They reveal hidden truths, unexpected sides of famous figures, and realities that challenge what we thought we knew. From lost species to staged revolutions, these images tell powerful untold stories. Photographs have an extraordinary power to capture the essence of a moment and evoke emotions. They often reveal new facets of history that challenge our preconceived notions. So, for today's video, we're going to explore 15 images that will change your view of the past. Number 15. Thylacine. It's estimated that as many as 500 species have become extinct in the past century, many of which have seen their population numbers fall because of human activity. But unlike many of those that lived hundreds or thousands of years ago, these were all around since the invention of the camera. This means that there are photographs of some rather peculiar animals that almost look as if they're fake, and they make you rethink what you thought you knew about the animal kingdom. One of the strangest was called the thylacine, or the Tasmanian tiger. It was a species of carnivorous marsupial that was originally found in mainland Australia, but towards the end they were only native to Tasmania. There were once a number of them in the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., which is where some of most recent images of them were captured in the early 20th century. And while they may look like striped dogs, they were far more closely related to kangaroos. With bodies that grew to around 51 inches or about 1.3 meters long, and tails that were up to 26 inches or 65 centimeters long, they were able to open their jaws unusually wide to around 80 degrees and rather than running would be more likely to hop. They were, for thousands of years, the apex predators in the regions where they lived, and it was only when humans began to hunt them to protect livestock that their time was up. Amazingly, though, this may not be the last we see of them, as a recent project has been started at the University of Melbourne that's attempting to take samples of thylacine DNA from specimens and recreate them using their closest living relatives, the mouse-like fat-tailed Dunnart. So keep an eye on this one. Number 14. Nikola Tesla and the magnifying transmitter. Nikola Tesla is undoubtedly one of the most famous and influential scientists and inventors in the last century, whose work with electricity was integral to the development of the modern-day alternating current electricity supply system. In 1899, he built a custom-designed lab in Colorado Springs, Colorado, specifically because it was a high-altitude location where he could further his study of high-voltage, high-frequency electricity and the potential of wireless power transmission. Ultimately, he would only use this facility for about a year, and it was sold and then torn down to help pay for outstanding debts. But that wasn't before this image was taken of him within the main lab, along with the largest Tesla coil that's ever been built, measuring over 49 feet in diameter. It's known as the magnifying transmitter. It was capable of producing artificial lightning that was up to 135 feet or 41 meters long, although in this image it shows ones that are 23 feet or 7 meters long, and it looks amazing with Tesla sitting so close to it. But it's not all as it seems in this image. Despite being captured in 1899, this is believed to be one of the first forged photographic images, proving that being aware of photoshopped pictures isn't just a recent phenomenon. This famous image was actually a double exposure, and this was the only way it could have been created because sitting so close to the device would have certainly exposed him to huge voltages. First, an image was captured of Tesla sat in the room, and then the film was again exposed with the apparatus running so it was imprinted on top of the original image. Number 13. The Hindenburg. In the early 1900s, before anyone knew just how quickly aircraft designs would develop, it looked as if air travel around the world would be done by airship. Through all, the highest levels of the Empire State Building were designed to be airship docking stations. Spearheaded by the German organization, the German Zeppelin Transport Company, flights were regularly made across Germany, and by the 1930s, transatlantic routes were added as well. They designed and built a new class of airship which would become the most famous ever, the Hindenburg, and in 1936 it completed 10 successful trips from Germany to the United States. In the following year, it did a round trip to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and then began the first of its 10 scheduled trips to the U.S. for that season on May 3rd. With a contract with American Airlines to also ferry people between Lakehurst and Newark for connecting airplane flights, it was heading towards Lakehurst in New Jersey, and was slightly delayed because of unexpected winds. Taking an alternative route, the Hindenburg would fly over Manhattan and the coastline of New Jersey, which brought thousands of spectators to see it for themselves. And then, hearing that the storm had passed, the captain directed the airship towards the planned landing site. This would, of course, result in one of the most known transport industry disasters of all time, as the hydrogen-filled airship caught on fire as it was attempting to dock with the mooring mast. With 36 fatalities, these images from the time were so shocking that they soon spread around the globe and immediately ended the airship transportation era for good. Number 12. Leo the Lion. There's nothing quite like the anticipation of sitting down to watch a movie, and from the moment the first studio logo appears on screen, you're ready to be entertained. Each studio's got its own recognizable ident, from Disney's Castle to more recently Netflix's Tudum, but probably the most famous of all is the one from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer that features Leo the Lion roaring. Nowadays, the lion that you see in the logo is a computer-generated version, but this was only possible very recently, and to create the desired effect from when it was first introduced by Goldwyn Pictures in 1917, footage and audio of a real lion was used. This, though, meant that the camera and microphone operators needed to work with real lions to capture what they needed, and this image shows just how frighteningly close they needed to be. This is of a lion called Jackie when his roar was being recorded, and it was this lion that you see at the beginning of classic movies like The Wizard of Oz. Used in the logo between 1928 and 1956, Jackie was also featured in more than 100 films, including the Tarzan series that starred Johnny Weissmuller, and Jackie was such a celebrity in his own right that he went on tour across the country. In all, 8 different lions have been used for the logo, including one that was actually called Leo and featured for 66 years before being introduced in 1957. But interestingly, executives decided to replace his roar with that of a tiger because they sound far more aggressive. It is arguably Jackie, though, with his calm temperament that made this all possible because of how close he needed to be to the crew with the tech that was available at the time. Number 11. Hospital smoking. We know now that smoking is incredibly bad for you, and as well as being banned in many public places around the world, huge sums of money are spent on campaigns to get people to stop or prevent them from starting in the first place. The idea of lighting up a cigarette in somewhere like an office or an aircraft is completely ridiculous by modern-day standards, but it hasn't always been like this. For a long time, smoking was even seen as a healthy thing to do, and the first airliners allowed you to smoke anytime you liked. Possibly the most surprising thing, though, is that patients were allowed to smoke in hospitals, and you'd often see doctors puffing on a cigar or pipe while they diagnose you, or even in the operation room. These photos show just how prolific smoking was in hospitals, where nurses would walk through wards with carts to sell toiletries, chewing gum, tobacco products, and even matches. It would be commonplace to see ashtrays on nightstands next to each bed, and most of them would even have the hospital's logo on them. Thankfully, as people began to realize just how bad tobacco smoke is, not just for the smoker but for those around them, hospitals stopped selling products like these and banned their use within their walls. It does make you wonder, though, what else may be common in places like that today that will one day be looked back on as ridiculous in the same kind of way? Cell phones? Number 10. The original Statue of Liberty. It's one of the most famous monuments in the world, and has stood proudly on Liberty Island in New York since 1886. But the Statue of Liberty that we see today looks very different from how it did originally, as these images show. The idea for the statue was first suggested in 1865 by a French historian who saw the importance of celebrating the 100th anniversary of U.S. independence in 1876. But, delayed by the Franco-Prussian War, work only began in 1875. The arrangement was that the statue itself would be funded and built by France, and that the land and pedestal would be provided by the United States. Soon after, the head and torch had already been completed and were displayed at international expos. Completed statue eventually arrived in New York in 1885, but because of funding issues, the pedestal wasn't ready until the following year. It was then that the 151-foot or 46-meter tall statue was completed. Made of a copper skin around an iron skeleton, early images show that the statue was originally a reddish color, and the green color that it is today is something that's truly unique to New York. Copper was always expected to oxidize, and when this happened, its color went through a number of stages. First, it became pinkish red because of the formation of a mineral called culprite, and then it grew darker because of the presence of tannerite. And then, because of the sulfur in the atmosphere from boat, car, and factory emissions, sulfuric acid began to develop, which produced green compounds. With the addition of chloride from the sea spray around Liberty Island, it turned even greener, meaning that had it been virtually installed anywhere else in the world, it wouldn't have been exposed to the same unique chemical composition and would have looked very different. Number 9. Che Guevara and Castro fishing. With images of his face still used prominently to this day, Che Guevara is one of the most famous revolutionaries of his time. Born in Argentina and originally training to be a doctor, he traveled to South America and was horrified at what he saw as being pain and suffering, being caused by the capitalist influence on the region from the United States, a position that was solidified once the CIA assisted with the coup in Guatemala in 1954. This eventually led him to meet Fidel and Raul Castro in Mexico City, and together they came up with a plan to sail to Cuba, where they would overthrow the US-backed dictator in the country and start a haven under a different way of rule. Led by Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution ousted the country's head of state in 1959, and the organization that took control would become the Communist Party of Cuba, with Fidel Castro as president and Che Guevara in various positions of power. This story has been told in many ways over the decades and had massive consequences for everyone in Cuba and the surrounding region, but Castro and Guevara are usually portrayed as intense and committed to the cause, so much so that it's all they'd ever focus on. Just like everyone else, though, they too needed time away from politics and were good friends behind the scenes for a time. This image, taken off the coast of Cuba in 1960, shows them both doing what they loved best when not planning revolutions: fishing for marlin. It is an amazingly candid picture of two people that were very careful about their public image, and shows a side of them that was rarely visible. Castro, of course, would go on to remain the leader of Cuba for decades, but Guevara would become bored of being in government and a few years later left Cuba to help others in need across Africa and in South America, before being caught by the Bolivian military in 1967, just 7 years after the fishing trip. Number 8. The earliest report of climate change. While there still may be some people who dispute the actual cause, it's now pretty much conclusive that because of human activity, the climate of our planet is changing. Overall temperatures seem to be increasing, and this is already resulting in unusual weather patterns across the globe. And if predictions are right, climate change could be the single biggest threat facing life as we know it in the coming decades. Cause of this is the way that since the Industrial Revolution we've been burning fossil fuels, and as a result it's been releasing more carbon into the atmospheres in such quantities that it's unable to cope with it. The narrative surrounding this, though, is that it was only relatively recently that the link between carbon release and climate change has been made, and for many decades people had no idea the damage they were causing. This image from 1912, though, shows that this isn't entirely true. It's of an article that was printed in a number of publications, such as the Rodney and Otamatia Times from New Zealand, the Braidwood Dispatch and Mining Journal from Australia, and a 1911 issue of Popular Mechanics in the United States, titled Coal Consumption Affecting Climate Change. Goes on to detail how in that year 2 billion tons of coal were being burned, which was releasing 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Concluding that this leads to a warming of the planet that will be considerable within a few centuries, it is proof that science at the time was already aware of the damage that was being caused. Similar articles were also occasionally being published in the following decades, but there was so little interest in a problem that was seen as being so far in the future that there wasn't the concern that there is today. If these warnings had been listened to by previous generations, then the disaster we potentially face could have been avoided. But mainly because of financial incentives, articles like this were ignored, and the problem has become a reality sooner than had been expected, thanks to a massive increase in coal and other fuels that's burnt on a yearly basis. Moving on to number 7. Afghanistan in the 1950s. Thanks to images and videos that have been broadcast around the world over the past 20 years, there's a view of Afghanistan that sees it as a nation that has a long way to go in terms of modernization and alignment with the quality of life seen in other countries around the world. What may come as a surprise, though, is that it was once very much on a path to a more liberal society while still being respectful to the more conservative factions of society. Despite undergoing centuries of conflict, the 1950s and 60s in Afghanistan were decades of wealth and westernization. Globally, the Cold War was taking hold, and the neutral Afghanistan found itself center stage. Courted by both the US and the Soviet Union, the leaders took financial aid from the US and machinery and weapons from the USSR. This resulted in modern buildings being built across the country, particularly in Kabul, alongside the traditional mud huts, and burqas became optional. With it being each person's right to choose how they wanted to dress, this series of images shows how life was back then, and even shows the motorcade from when President Eisenhower visited the country to meet with King Mohammed Zahir Shah to talk about increasing aid. The idea of an American president making such a public tour of Afghanistan is, of course, completely impossible right now and shows just how much the country has changed. A series of coups, invasions, and civil wars began in the 70s, which completely changed the face of the country, and it sadly led to a regression of the rights and opportunities that ordinary Afghan citizens now have. Number 6. The 1899 Newsboy Strike. In modern times, there are strict rules in most countries about how old you need to be before you can begin working. Brought in to prevent child exploitation and to give everyone a chance to get an education and enjoy a childhood before becoming part of the real world. In the US, the minimum age for non-agricultural jobs is 14, and there are restrictions on the number of hours and roles you can do until you're 18. This, of course, wasn't always the case, and in the late 1800s, the child workforce was so entrenched in society that there were a series of strikes to improve working conditions. The newspaper industry, particularly in New York, relied heavily on newsboys or newspaper hawkers to sell publications to people in the street. Morning editions of papers would normally be sent straight to subscribers, but the afternoon editions almost entirely relied on this workforce. Often, the children of poor immigrant families would work after school activities from as young as they were able to, and would be expected to buy bundles of papers first and then have to sell them to make a profit. This system worked majorly in favor of the publishers and not at all in favor of the newsboys. So, in 1899, they went on strike. This image shows what we'd see today as underage workers trying to make a living in New York, and soon after they'd stop selling two particular publications, the New York World and the New York Journal. Lasting 2 weeks, the strike of the New York World, a paper run by Joseph Pulitzer, saw its circulation fall from 360,000 per day to 120,000 per day, and the publishers were soon forced to give in to the demands. They brought in a new system whereby they would buy back any papers that were unsold, which significantly increased the amount of money that the newsboys were able to make. The success of these strikes inspired similar ones across the country in the following decades, and it was only in the 1930s when the government instigated a law aimed at improving adult employment that the tradition of children selling newspapers fell out of fashion. Number 5. The first launch. Rockets are now sent into space virtually every other day, so much so that it's now seen as a common occurrence. But it wasn't that long ago that each launch was a truly special occasion. Historically, there's probably none as important as the one that's shown in this image, which was taken in July of 1950 and shows the very first launch from Cape Canaveral. It was an RTVG-4 bumper, which was a sounding rocket that had been built by the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and was made up of the first stage of a German V-2 rocket, which had been designed by the Nazis and was the first long-range guided ballistic missile, along with the American-designed WAC Corporal, which was the first craft capable of reaching hypersonic speeds. The bumper program was one of the earlier stages of the U.S.'s space exploration development and saw 8 of these rockets being launched in total, the first 6 of which took off from the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and the final 2 from Cape Canaveral. This new launch site was chosen because it's as close to the equator as possible in the mainland United States, which allows launches to take better advantage of the Earth's rotation while also having an ocean downrange, which means there are very few people at risk if something happens. This meant that while the bumper rocket had been tested for functionality at White Sands, it was able to be pushed to its fullest form in Cape Canaveral, and the launch in this image shows the 7th bumper test, called Bumper 8, that was not only the first from this site but also the one that set an altitude record for the time at almost 250 miles or 400 kilometers, which is higher than the International Space Station's orbit, and it became the first to prove it could reach hypersonic speeds. This was undeniably a game-changing moment for the space race, and the scientific packages on board were used to learn far more about the conditions in orbit to help design the next spacecraft that would eventually take humans into orbit and to the moon. Number 4. Wilbur Wright's demonstration flights. The Wright brothers are famous for changing the face of modern transport after building and flying the first airplane in 1903. Over the next few years, they continued developing their invention to make the Wright Flyer 3, which, with a three-axis control system, was the first actual practical aircraft design. While the story of the first flight is one that's often mentioned in the history books, their career following that important event is lesser known. Despite having overcome a number of engineering problems to make flight possible, people still weren't convinced about the idea of flying, so Wilbur Wright began publicly exhibiting it to people. The first of these exhibitions took place in Le Mans, France, at a racehorse track, and while others were in attendance, they had their own flying machines. It was his ability to perform technically challenging maneuvers that made him truly stand out from the rest. Orville Wright tried to do something similar in the United States, but after being injured in an accident that also led to the first aircraft-related fatality, he thought it best to leave the display flying to his brother. In late 1908, he continued to break altitude and speed records and moved back to the U.S. in mid-1909, when they received rapturous homecoming led by President Taft. It's from the 4th of October 1909 that this image comes from, though, when Wilbur Wright performed a series of aerial stunts in his aircraft around New York City. As many as 1 million people lined the streets to see it with their own eyes during the Hudson-Fulton celebration, and after taking off from Governor's Island with a canoe attached to his plane in case he needed to land in water, he flew around the Statue of Liberty. While most people were entertained by this, there were accusations of recklessness, particularly with the risk of damaging the national icon if anything went wrong. And this would be one of the last display flights, as following this, further revelations were made about their questionable business tactics and whether they were truly the inventors of their aircraft in the first place. Number 3. Toppling Saddam Hussein's statue. To this day, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 remains a contentious act, and it was certainly a hugely controversial decision at the time. This meant that the governments waging the war had to work harder than ever to keep their nations on side and continually provide propaganda to support what they were doing, and one of the biggest revisions of truth took place on April 9th of that year, just 20 days after it started. No matter the reasons for being there, there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein was a tyrannical leader in the face of the perceived dangers the country posed. So, there were celebrations around the world when Iraqi citizens defaced and toppled a 39-foot statue of him that had been installed in Baghdad's Firdos Square just a year earlier. Problem, though, is that it wasn't exactly the spontaneous act of a local crowd that the world was led to believe. And instead, these images show that it was mainly U.S. Marines who were responsible, having attached a cable to it from an M88 armored recovery vehicle. In what was described as one of the most staged photo ops since the Second World War, alternate angles show that there wasn't as large a crowd as some published and altered pictures show. And a later report by the Los Angeles Times found out that the whole idea of toppling the statue had come from a Marine colonel and not an Iraqi citizen. Furthermore, troops had used loudspeakers to whip up the crowd that was there into a frenzy to create an event that would make headlines around the world. An act that has since been criticized because it detracted attention for stories that were far more important. Number 2. Visiting the pyramids. The Giza Pyramid Complex is probably the most recognized historical site in the world. It's made up of the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre, the Pyramid of Menkaure, and a number of smaller structures, including the Great Sphinx. Everything was built during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt's Old Kingdom around 4,600 years ago. They are incredibly important ancient sites where artifacts and information have been found that have revealed so much about ancient Egypt. And it's recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and they're protected monuments that, despite having millions of visitors each year, have strict rules about where you can and can't go. This, though, hasn't always been the case, and it's only in relatively recent times that restrictions on places like this have been in place for their long-term preservation. In the 19th century, things were very different, and these images show what tourist trips to the pyramids were like back then. Visitors can be seen climbing up the sides of the pyramids, and as recently as 1938, sat on top of the Great Pyramid itself having a picnic. Trying to do this now would, of course, quickly get you arrested, and for very good reason. It was discovered that because of their age, the stones that the pyramids are made from are easily damaged by being climbed on, and increasing the number of people doing so was causing them to rapidly deteriorate. People in these images were, therefore, some of the last to ever scale these ancient monuments in such a cavalier way, and never again will anyone be treated to such a spectacular view. Number 1. View from the window at Lodra. With the advent of smartphones and digital photography, it's now far easier to take a photo than ever before. And in 2015, an incredible record was broken in that more photographs were taken in that year than had been taken on film in the entire history of analog cameras. Due to their nature, the ones that we capture will, today in theory, always exist in a digital form, especially once they're shared online. But the same can't be said for those that were taken on film. This image, called the view from the window at Lodra, wasn't the first photograph to be captured, but it's the oldest known surviving one. Created by Nicephore Niepce, a French inventor in 1826, it depicts a building and an estate called Lodra, which is in a French commune. Camera tech was very different then, though, and the process of capturing this grainy image was a complex one. He used a camera obscura, which is a darkened room with a pinhole at one end to let the light in, which projected the image onto a pewter plate that was coated with bitumen. In the brightly lit areas, the bitumen hardened, but it remained soft in the darker parts and would later be washed away by oil of lavender and white petroleum. This chemical reaction took quite some time, though, and it's believed he used an exposure of between 8 hours and several days to get this result. Modern colorization techniques have been able to enhance the image to show more of what was the view from this room would have looked like, and it's amazing to see how far the technology has come since its origins. The reactions within the image have continued to take place at a slow rate since it was first created, and a test by ion beam analysis in 2007 found that the image is slowly corroding because of oxidation. First, it was probably a lot clearer than it is now, and much of the distortion is due to this decay, meaning that within a few years it'll likely have completely worn away and will be lost forever. From the haunting final images of the thylacine to the fading capture of view from the window at Le Gras, these moments bring history to life. They remind us that the past was real, complex, and often very different from how we imagine it. Photographs don't just preserve memories, they reshape perspective. And one day, our images may be studied the same way.